Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. This is our fifth of our Lunch and Learn series, but second of our focus on specifically human trafficking in the fishing industry. Last week, if you joined us, we had New York Times reporter Ian Urbina with the Outlaw Ocean Project. This week, we have Karen Stauss of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit at the Department of Justice. She's on the Senior Policy Counsel. And before we get to her, I would like to do some brief words on preferred video conduct. If you could please all remain muted and have your videos off for the duration of the chat. We will be accepting questions throughout the chat. If you could please focus them towards Karen Lynn Sola. We have 3 Karens today, so Karen Lynn Sola will be the one you send the questions to, or feel free to put them in the group chat. We will get to them later after the main discussion portion. To start, we will also, excuse me, like to hear from Shilpa, who is going to speak about the Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, who's presenting this Lunch and Learn series to us today. It's the 3rd of its kind in the nation and the 1st of its kind in Florida. Shilpa, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shilpa Finnerty. I'm Senior Fellow and Community Advisor for the Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, which we lovingly like to call the HTMS Center at UCF. The center, as Tricia mentioned, is one of 3 in the country. That's a university level center. And our 5 main goals are community engagement, research, education, training, and survivor scholarship and student fellowship. So we are a small but mighty team bringing you these remote webinars during hopefully what's the tail end of the pandemic, fingers crossed. Thank you so much for joining us and showing your support and your continued interest in this topic. And I'll turn it back over to Tricia.
Thank you, Shilpa. And yes, thank you for the center for putting this together for us. We're hoping to also keep these series going, even with the face of the pandemic. Whether or not it clears up, we will continue to bring you these Lunch and Learn series. So right now, Brendan, if we could put up the survey, we do have a question for you all. We're wondering if you can guess, or if you know, how far out is the federal declaration for territorial waters. So please, I showed my New Jersey a little there. If you could please put your vote in, and we'll reveal the answer before our Q&A later in the discussion. So a little bit of a cliffhanger for you all. We'll keep this open just for a minute or so. And as you get your votes in, as I mentioned, today's special guest is Karen Stauss of the Department of Justice. She's also personally had 15 years in the nonprofit sector focused on human trafficking. And we will be talking today about a recent report that her Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit has published regarding fishery and human trafficking specifically. Okay, if we could please hide the poll now, and we'll show the answer and the results later in the discussion. Thank you, Brandon. So to start with this discussion, Karen, if please tell us about the task force that you're a part of. I know it's been around since 2018. So if you could briefly give us a history of the task force.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Stauss and really happy to be here. Congress directed the Department of Justice to convene this task force, which we did in the fall of 2018, as you said. And the task force had a really very specific role, according to the request from Congress, which was to analyze what is really a very complicated picture around jurisdiction over human trafficking crimes when they occur in international waters. So you just put up the question about territorial waters. We have a full page in the report that we ultimately published explaining the legal and jurisdictional distinctions between different terms and how they apply to the U.S. ability to enforce different types of laws when they are on the oceans and different parts of the high seas that are divided and subdivided in different ways. So Congress asked us specifically to look at the legal and jurisdictional issues that affect human trafficking and the ability to enforce laws against human trafficking in international waters, and then to make recommendations to Congress. So that would be recommendations around legislation, but also essentially recommendations to ourselves as the executive branch about what could be done to further enforce and prevent, but also create accountability when forced labor occurs on the high seas. So ultimately, after a lot of discussion and consultation with experts within government, but also external stakeholders, so that includes people who advocate for workers, but also private sector representatives. We issued our report and recommendations just a couple of months ago. So now I think the question is for our task force, the next steps. I mean, as far as what Congress asked us to do, our work is done because they asked us simply to review and analyze the legal issues and to make recommendations. And that is the report that we submitted in January. But obviously the work on human trafficking is not done. And so the next step with the recommendations partly will lie with Congress. And so that's something that folks who are interested in human trafficking can really take up with Congress. Some types of action really would require changes to our law. But some of the actions that we found would be effective are actions that agencies within the executive branch could begin to implement. So I think we're right now in a transition. Obviously, we're waiting in many of our departments, including the Department of Justice, we're waiting for our new leadership to come in to the Department of Justice, and some of the relevant agencies are in that same situation. But once they're in place, then we'll be able to see what other types of progress that we can make. And in the meanwhile, some of the recommendations are really already within our purview. And so, some steps might be going forward already.
Excellent. And we'll get into the specifics of those recommendations a little later. So last week we learned from Ian Urbina about his firsthand accounts of different victims at sea in a variety of crimes. Could you please share with us, especially for those who were not able to join last week, what is known about the prevalence and types of crimes in international waters, specifically regarding human trafficking?
Yes, so there are a range of different crimes that are committed at sea. Obviously, it's a place where just purely because of the physical characteristics, it's difficult to detect crime. One of our report, and so my focus today is going to be very focused on the problem of human trafficking and specifically forced labor, but it is very linked to other violations, namely unsustainable fishing practices. So overfishing essentially on the high seas is something that poses a threat, obviously, to national economies in which fishing plays a role. Specifically, it can be very damaging to coastal fishing communities whose lives in many cases have been dependent for generations on fishing. And now some of the decimation of stocks that are closer to the coasts have pushed workers further and further out to sea. And so, and then this overfishing also has an impact on consumers. There's environmental impacts. It's not only overfishing of fishing stocks, but also what's called bycatch, other types of sea living resources that are caught up, not intended to be consumed, but just get caught up due to the fishing practices that are used. So I bring that up even though I really want to talk about forced labor, because there is a connection between the two. And the report that we published does draw the connection between those unsustainable fishing practices and forced labor. Because fishing vessels have been pushed farther and farther out to sea, they have to stay on the high seas for longer periods of time. They're profit margins are potentially lessened as a result. The jobs themselves become less and less attractive. And what we see with all kinds of economic sectors around the world is that if the jobs are undesirable, they in some cases are taken by workers who are vulnerable due to perhaps coming from places where they're in poverty, where they are very desperate for what they believe will be a well-paying job that will help them take care of themselves and their families and educate their children, but that end up being not the job that they think that they've signed up for. So the farther out to sea, the more difficult the conditions, the more isolated the workers are. And so that's why I draw that link between, and our report draws the link between unsustainable fishing practices and human trafficking. So before we go any further, I think I should just say human trafficking it encompasses both forced labor or labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Our report is very focused on forced labor, which under US law is the securing of labor or services of the person through the use of force or coercion. And I want to emphasize coercion, which is very important. It is not necessary to hold someone in physical restraint or physically threaten their lives in order for something to qualify as human trafficking. The concept of coercion is extremely important to understand in human trafficking, and under US law, it encompasses any threats of harm that would cause a reasonable person who's in the victim situation to fear that either they or some other person would suffer serious harm if they do not continue to provide the labor. And I think this is very important to understand, especially for some of us who might be coming from a privileged perspective in the United States, where a violent crime or a threat of a physical assault feels like a more serious crime. For any of you who have spent time in places where people are really facing economic challenges, many people would far rather be subject to a one-time physical assault than the constant stress and anxiety and fear of poverty. And so the threat of financial harm to many workers who are on fishing vessels all around the world is extreme. It's a very serious threat that is extraordinarily powerful. And so I think that's very important to understand, both in the fishing context, but also in many contexts where we see labor trafficking occur.
Yes, and as you probably know, with your 15 years before your work with the Department of Justice, coercion doesn't stop at sea. The human trafficking victims their vulnerabilities are being taken advantage of everywhere. And that's where a lot of us are here today, are to figure out how do we stop that? How do we fight that? So with your report, you did point out some known gaps and make recommendations regarding those gaps. Before we get into that, I want to know what you all discovered about what is already being done about these known crimes and what is already being done to counteract them.
Yeah. So I want to focus specifically on the human trafficking crimes and what can be done by US government agencies. First, on US fishing vessels, and we really have to divide or separate our discussion of what can be done on US vessels, which are licensed by the, flagged in the United States, versus foreign vessels, because the situation is different. So on US vessels, we can criminally prosecute forced labor, even if the forced labor occurred outside of US territorial waters, if it's a US flagged vessel. We can prosecute the captain of the vessel, the person who's directly exerting force or coercion against workers, but we also can prosecute a company in the supply chain if that company, and by that I mean, there's an end user, maybe a grocery store, who buys from an intermediary who buys from the captain on the vessel, or who has some type of arrangement. I mean, it can vary significantly, but who the point is that there's multiple steps in that chain. So we have the ability potentially to criminally prosecute someone who's farther downstream in the supply chain, such as a national grocery chain, if that actor knows or recklessly disregarded the presence of forced labor within that larger venture. So if that fish is caught outside the United States, even if it's caught on a US vessel, but it's caught outside the United States, it's considered an import. And separate from criminal prosecution, US government has the ability to block those goods at the border because US law also prohibits the importation of any goods produced with forced labor, which looks like that's going to be the subject of a discussion toward the end of March that you're hosting, which I think is very important. That's a really significant development in US law that we're now enforcing this prohibition on the importation of goods produced with forced labor. And that's regardless of knowledge or reckless disregard. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has an Office of Law Enforcement. NOAA is able to board US vessels and also requires some US vessels to carry observers. So anytime that those law enforcement board or there's an observer in place, although their role does not relate to human trafficking, they are there to observe other types of violations of other types of measures related to fishing. It's possible that they would see signs of human trafficking. And then US Coast Guard also can board United States vessels either when they're in the United States or when they're in international waters in order to enforce US laws. The other important area that I want to mention where the US has the ability to act is with regard to providing assistance to victims. If the victims are in the United States and they've been victim of forced labor on a vessel in international waters on a US vessel, they can be provided assistance in the United States. Even if they are a foreign national, they can be potentially provided with assistance in the United States and may be protected through a special visa called the T visa. If the victims are overseas, it can be more difficult to provide assistance, but the report does describe some of the types of assistance that potentially can be provided to the victims overseas as well. So now, that's on US vessels. And this is a complicated picture, so I'm just trying to summarize that at a high level. There's a lot more details in our report if anyone is more interested. So on foreign vessels, we do, when forced labor occurs in international waters on foreign vessels, the picture is somewhat different. We can potentially have criminal jurisdiction in those cases, but it's very dependent on the connection of the potential defendant to the United States. So, I won't get too much into the details, but I think suffice it to say that there's a possibility of exercising jurisdiction in those cases. Again, foreign vessels where forced labor occurs outside US waters, but it's not in every case, and it's going to be dependent on some of that nexus between who the potential defendant in the US. However, the customs prohibition that I described earlier still applies. So those goods from those foreign vessels cannot be imported into the United States.
Yes, and then you mentioned, so the two groups, US vessels and non-US vessels, but then also there's a third group in the report where it's non-US vessels who have goods that may be going into the US. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of details in that report. I did share it in the chat if anyone is curious to read the entire report themselves. But in case they're not, we'll go into, Karen, please tell us now what the gaps that you've noticed specifically regarding government policy and efforts in the fight against human trafficking in international waters. What did you all find the main gaps to be?
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if anyone noticed when in answering the previous question, I mentioned laws that we have in place and that we can criminally prosecute. But so far, we have not criminally prosecuted forced labor on fishing vessels that are operating in international waters, whether those were US vessels or foreign vessels, whether the target was, a vessel master or a corporation downstream in the supply chain. So I think that really points out that's really the result of significant gaps in our ability to potentially detect human trafficking. And I think that it might be fair to say that one of our greatest difficulties right now with respect to both US vessels and foreign vessels is that issue of detection. There are jurisdictional issues, and the report does make some recommendations around that, but probably at this point, the most significant gap is detection. And I should say that that's not only an issue on fishing vessels, that's something that US Department of Justice has been working very hard to improve our ability to become aware of human trafficking and specifically labor trafficking cases that occur in the United States. These violations are often confused with simple labor exploitation issues without the realization that there may actually be force or coercion at play. So again, with regard to detection, I want to separate the discussion of US vessels and foreign vessels. We have not, as US government, and I think the report really intentionally makes very clear that we have not identified forced labor on US vessels as a United States government. There is at least one case, which is a civil lawsuit that was brought in the US by two fishing workers. They were Indonesian workers on a US vessel. And this was a civil lawsuit brought in 2018. And the description in the complaint in that civil lawsuit, I think is really typical. And I think it could be really informative for all of you about the types of problems that these workers are facing. So in that particular case, they were two Indonesian workers working on a tuna fishing boat and a US vessel. And they faced high recruitment fees, which led them to be in debt. If you'll forgive me, I'm not trying to do a pun, but there was a sort of bait and switch with respect to the nature of the job. They were promised a much better job than they ultimately got. They were, according to their complaint, put into very hazardous and unsafe working conditions where they were working up to 20 hours a day, sometimes sleeping on deck. They were ultimately told that they would face a financial penalty if they left the job early. By nature of the job, they were very isolated, and their passports have been confiscated. So all of those, each one of those factors is really what we would consider not necessarily on its own equal to forced labor, but those are indicators of potential forced labor that if we were able to have systems in place to detect, then we would be able to further criminally investigate. So on US vessels, we know that based on reporting, I mean, it's not just that civil lawsuit that I mentioned, but we know based on reporting from outside stakeholders that there are risks, and some of those indicators of human trafficking exist on US vessels. Fishing workers on US vessels, so foreign fishing workers on US vessels that are plying the oceans are not required to have a US visa. What does that mean? When that US vessel comes into a US port, those workers are not allowed to leave the vessel. So they can really be confined to the vessel for months at a time. We know that, as with many other sectors, they are sometimes facing debts, and those debts arise from recruitment fees. Essentially, the workers are paying to access what they hope will be very good jobs. But if it is a forced labor situation, then they'll face that bait and switch, where the debt, instead of being paid off and leading to a financial windfall, which is what they're hoping for, instead that debt is used to hold them in place because they can't leave for fear of returning to their home country still in debt, in which case they would face very serious financial harm in some cases. So in the US, on these US vessels, we don't necessarily, and this is something that the report discusses, we don't necessarily have clear avenues to detect those indicators. There's no, many of you have probably heard of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which contains wage and hour protections for many US workers. There's also a Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Workers Protection Act that protects migrant workers in agriculture in the US. There's no law with respect to wage and hour and what we would consider sort of basic worker protections on US vessels in international waters with respect to these foreign workers. There are some safety and health regulations that apply that are sort of minimally enforced with respect to the workers. And so as a result, we're very dependent on reports that workers or worker advocates may be able to make on workers' behalf. And for many reasons, you know, it's very difficult for workers who are in those situations, you can just imagine, to even know where they would make a report, much less feel comfortable and safe in making the report. So as a result, we do not have a lot of clear avenues to detect forced labor indicators. And that is, I think, really emerges as one of the most significant gaps in the report. On foreign vessels, you can imagine that all of that applies and then some. So similar detection issues apply. US government enforcement agencies have more limited ability to potentially board foreign vessels. US Coast Guard, for example, can only board a foreign vessel in international waters where there's some form of consent. So that could be consent by the vessel master, or it could be consent by the foreign government that flagged that vessel. And that does sometimes occur. Currently, the agreements in place with foreign governments mostly relate to the sustainable fishing issues that we talked about early on. So they don't relate specifically to detecting human trafficking issues. So I think you know, there's a number of other gaps, but I think, you know, the most important one that emerges in the report to strategically, I think, is this issue of being able to detect potential issues when they exist.
Of course, and I know with the fight against human trafficking, it's definitely difficult to really prioritize, because you want to just, you know, make sure everyone who's suffering is free and prevent everyone at the same time prevent anyone else from being enslaved. So definitely breaking down priorities is important. And with that, you had 27 recommendations in your report to Congress and the executive branch to fill in the gaps that one of which you just identified for us. Could you please summarize the key recommendations for us today?
Sure. So I think some of the key ones, they're sort of the flip side of what I've already described. So, and some of them require congressional action. So specifically on US vessels, I mentioned that foreign workers are not required to be provided with a US visa. This results in them being more isolated. They're not necessarily known to the US government until the time that they enter US port, and then even then there's minimal opportunity for interaction. And then they're not allowed to leave the port area. So one of the recommendations in the report is that a visa category should be either created or expanded to accommodate these foreign workers. And a couple of things that may be helpful about that. Right now, under US law, any foreign worker who is a temporary worker in the United States is provided with a State Department Know Your Rights brochure. And it's available in 40 plus languages at this point. And we know that it has been helpful in providing workers with information. First, what are their rights? And second, if their rights are violated, whom can they contact? The National Human Trafficking Hotline in the United States, which is operated by a nonprofit organization, not by law enforcement, has had calls from victims and potential victims who became aware of that potential source because of that Know Your Rights brochure that they have to be provided if they get a U.S. worker visa. In addition, the report recommends that, like some other guest worker visas in the United States, that workers who obtain that visa, the recruitment fees, worker paid recruitment fees, are prohibited. If you take away nothing else from today's discussion, I think it's the importance of recruitment fees to, and recruitment fees are really anything, very broadly defined, anything the worker pays in order to access a job. Imagine you're not getting paid for your job, but you're actually paying in order to access the job. Anything a worker pays is included in that definition. So the charging of this broad category of recruitment fees is really a tool that traffickers use to put workers in these very difficult situations that in some cases evolve into debt bondage situations where the worker feels they cannot leave because of these unfair fees. Some US visas, not all US visas, but some US visas already prohibit worker paid recruitment fees. US government procurement, when we as a US government buy goods, our contractors and our subcontractors are prohibited also from charging recruitment fees. But in some cases, private sector has not done the work to root out recruitment fees. And I'm specifically worker paid recruitment fees. So this is an area of growing consensus around the world globally that worker paid recruitment fees are really an exploitive practice that often can lead to debt bondage and situations of forced labor. And so the report recommends that recruitment fees should be strictly prohibited, and that can be through the visa program. But even if Congress does not follow our recommendation and create a visa, they still could create a law that prohibits US vessels from charging recruitment fees. So that concept, again, is a very, very important one. So I mentioned before that there's no wage and hour protections for workers on US vessels. The report recommends filling that gap. So, and this can be somewhat complicated because there's some concern from industry actors that if there's just if some type of minimum wage, for example, is applied, that it could potentially destroy any US ocean-going fishing industry, because it's already an industry where profits are hard to come by and profit margins are slim. And so there's a concern that if there's, for example, a minimum wage, that would destroy the industry. So that's some of what we have heard from some private sector actors. So the report did recommend that there should be a law put in place to provide basic protections to workers, but the recommendation is really accompanied by an important element of that, which is that that should be done after a careful study of the industry to determine, what the appropriate way is for this particular sector, which operates in very particular ways, which sometimes have worked out very well for fishers. In some cases, fishers in US vessels are earning really good incomes for a set number of months during which fishing takes place, and then leaving vessels and then maybe coming back again a year later for that same set number of months, and in some cases fishers are doing very well. But we know that there's other cases where that's not the case. So the report recommends careful study of the industry and the structure of the industry and how profits are spread, from workers, all the way up to others who are profiting in the supply chain, in order to appropriately recommend the right wage and hour protection for this particular set of workers. Those are some of the key recommendations with respect to U.S. vessels. So for foreign, to address forced labor that occurs on foreign vessels, the report has a number of recommendations around how the U.S. government could collaborate more with foreign governments to do a range of things. First, those foreign governments have the first responsibility to create accountability for vessels that they are flagging. And so it's really encouraging the U.S. government to work more with foreign governments to strengthen those foreign governments' ability to bring accountability. Also to strengthen some of the collaboration I mentioned, where, with foreign governments' consent, U.S. enforcement officials potentially can board foreign vessels that are in international waters. We didn't, today get into detail in the discussion, but the report explains that many fisheries that exist in the oceans are managed under the purview of what's called RFMOs, or Regional Fishery Management Organizations. These are basically treaty bodies that, for example, there might be one for tuna in the Western Pacific, for example. They are primarily focused on, fishing issues, but there's the possibility that they also could consider other types of issues that arise. And in particular, one of those RFMOs, as an example, created a non-binding resolution a couple of years ago that addressed the importance of preventing forced labor on fishing vessels. So that's definitely important. Now, I think one of the key actors here, so I mentioned our report makes recommendations to Congress, and then we also identified actions that the executive branch could take. But obviously, the private sector, large multinationals who are using, who are profiting from fishing of our oceans, are a very important stakeholder here. And there's a number of steps that the fishing industry also potentially can take. And so, and in some cases they have taken. So the report provides some examples of important steps that fishing industry have taken. In some cases, creating voluntary systems that would strengthen their ability to prevent and respond to forced labor. With that said, there's always good actors, and there's always those actors who are trying to escape accountability and get away with what they can get away with, which unfortunately in this case, in the forced labor case, has very, very tragic results. And so the report makes some recommendations too around strengthening both collaboration, but also accountability for corporations, so that they also are using their considerable power within their supply chain to improve working conditions and to prevent forced labor within their supply chains.
Yeah, well, so it really is an incredible team effort to help fight this. We're going to need collaborations, as you mentioned, with other governments, with the private sector, especially with the nature of authority at sea. We need those collaborations. And even with your report, it was an interdisciplinary team to publish the findings. But so with your team's report, you focus on federal policy. But I'm wondering, with everything that you discovered, how can your everyday consumer verify that they're not in support of human trafficking?
Yeah, sure. And yes, you're absolutely right. While this report was submitted to Congress by Department of Justice, it was a very broad effort. And in fact, much of the report deals with things that are really outside the purview of the Department of Justice. So we had Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Labor, Justice, State, and Treasury, as well as the U.S. Trade Representative, and then within each of those departments, quite a number of components of those departments that participated in our task force. So it really was a team effort, and it also included consultation with industry actors and worker advocacy organizations as well. So the other actor, I think, that you mentioned that is hugely critical and really fundamental is consumers, the end users of these, which in this case, fishing products, but in general, many products that we consume in the United States where there are risks of forced labor. So one useful tool that exists that the Department of Labor actually created, and I think anyone on this call right now can download onto their phone, is called Sweat and Toil. And it doesn't necessarily, unfortunately, we don't yet have the ability to connect, okay, we know there's forced labor on this fishing vessel, and then now we can, clearly say to the public, okay, this, and this, grocery chain or restaurant group is using forced labor. But we can help consumers identify the potential risk. And so that's what Sweat and Toil does. And the U.S. Department of Labor has done a lot of work as it's required to do under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to identify goods from countries where there is forced labor. So for example, bricks in India or fish on in Thai fishing vessels. There's more than 100 goods and countries that are sources of those goods that have been identified in the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child labor and forced labor. So Sweat and Toil is an app that consumers can use on their phone to figure out where there's potential risk. The thing is, companies need to know, you may be a consumer, you may also be an investor or a shareholder. Companies need to know that ultimately that their consumers care about that, and that helps push them to take more action, what is called due diligence within their supply chains to ensure that they don't have forced labor. So I think consumers, ask your grocer, how do they know? What steps are they taking? And if they don't have any response, then that it doesn't necessarily tell you that there's forced labor. But if they are not able to give some type of description about steps that they take to try to prevent forced labor in their supply chains, then you can tell them that you want them to do that, and post. I think there's all kinds of ways to communicate now with companies through online and social media, and I think it's really important that there just be a partnership. This is something that's been very important to U.S. government policy, is partnerships with between good actors in industry who are providing good examples of strong due diligence, and with the general public, and just making sure that companies are aware that the general public also cares about this, which helps encourage companies to do the right thing and take those steps to prevent forced labor in their supply chain.
For sure, yes, education, great first step, I would say, and that's a huge of what we're trying to do right now with the center and with my work. I didn't mention this earlier, but I produce for the local PBS station, and I try to also bring as much awareness as I can on our airwaves. Shilpa, thank you for sharing the link to the Sweat and Toil app if anyone wants to download that. Thank you, Karen, for sharing that with us. So Karen, in your career, just to wrap this up before we get into Q&A, so in your career, you focused on both human trafficking at sea and domestic crime. And I'm curious, what keeps you going? What keeps you going in this fight?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as I've been working on international human rights issues since I graduated law school, which is now 19 years ago, I often have been asked, how do you handle it? Because you're always working on issues that are so depressing, where people have suffered such bad harm and there's so much trauma associated with it. There's also vicarious trauma for those who are exposed to those issues over a long period of time, even if they haven't themselves, directly been the victim of it. And so I often have gotten that question, and especially, working on such an extreme human rights violation as human trafficking, which I've been working on now specifically for about 14 years, first in nonprofit organizations and now for the Department of Justice for the last 4.5 years. So for me, I really think it's the people that I get to work with that makes this not depressing work to do, but on the contrary, extremely inspiring work to do. The type of people that I've been able to encounter both in the United States and working overseas, as I spent several years working on human trafficking in places like Nepal and Haiti and Ghana and Democratic Republic of Congo. The people that I have met, and especially in some cases, survivors of these types of crime who are now working to prevent other people from suffering what they have suffered, is incredibly inspiring. And I have sat in so many rooms with people who I just look at and think, they are on the order of, famous names that we all know from history, but, people who are literally risking their lives in many of these contexts in order to prevent other people from suffering these types of extreme harm. So, I always remember one time sitting in India in a room with activists and leaders who were fighting against the ongoing caste system there, which, while illegal, is still continues and is really used to justify what in many ways looks like chattel slavery, where people are just inheriting this situation in life that is, where they're held in bondage. And it's something that is expected within the social structure where they are in some of the states in India. And I just remember looking around the room and just thinking to myself, so I'm basically sitting with, the Martin Luther King, or, even the Frederick Douglass of this movement that is equally as significant, and they're facing the same types of risks of attack because of the work that they're trying to do. So that for me has always made the work much more inspiring than other words. I mean, the friends I've made over the last 20 years, just like friends who continue to inspire me every day. And we have that in the US too. I mean, a lot of survivors of human trafficking who have become really important activists now, both directly serving survivors of trafficking, but also advocating, holding our feet to the fire as US government about what needs to be done in order to improve our protection of victims and holding traffickers accountable.
Yes, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I've met and I still get to work with some of the greatest people, some of them on this chat right now, in this fight against human trafficking. So though we see the worst, we also get to meet the best of humanity, which is nice. Well, before we get into Q&A, I'll give a little last call for questions. And Brendan, if you could share the results of the poll, please, of what we all thought as far as the correct answer to, and remember, the federal declaration of territorial waters. So it seems we were pretty split, I would say, but the correct answer is 12 nautical miles. So there you go. We had 38% with that correct answer. So moving on with the other Q&As, we have our first one for you, Karen. Is there a link between piracy and coerced labor on the seas?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I probably can't comment on it very directly because we did not look at that specifically in our report. What I can say more generally, I think, is that there's a significant overlap between transnational organized crime and transnational criminal networks, in which case, the type of piracy that I think the question is contemplating potentially could fall into that, and human trafficking. So, and sometimes that could occur in interesting ways where, transnational organizations that may be involved with smuggling also may end up putting some of the individuals, human smuggling may end up, when you first encounter them, it looks like they are simply smuggling humans who may have consented to that. But in the end, some of those individuals end up in human trafficking situations. And so in general, there is a link between transnational organized crime, but though our report doesn't specifically look at piracy. So.
Gotcha. All right. Well, second question for you. Are NOAA and the U.S. Coast Guard observers trained to identify human trafficking on vessels?
Yeah. So the observer system is something that is run by NOAA. So NOAA has both its own Office of Law Enforcement as well as requiring certain U.S. vessels to carry observers. And one of the key recommendations in the report, so I'm so glad you raised this question, one of the key recommendations in the report is that those agencies that have some direct interaction and literally just some exposure to the workers should be trained systematically on the indicators of forced labor. Not necessarily because they would become criminal investigative agencies, but so that they could make referrals to the appropriate part of the US government who would do the criminal investigation, which in the typical case would be HSI. That's Homeland Security Investigations within the Department of Homeland Security. But HSI can't investigate if it's not even aware of there being a potential problem. So the report does recommend that right now it's not part of NOAA's mandate to address human trafficking, though there have been some efforts to create broader awareness within NOAA, but that's not something that's been required legally at this point. And so what our report recommends is that all those agencies that are having some exposure to workers on the vessels would have more training about being able to identify indicators and then knowing where to report when they do identify those indicators.
Yeah, that's
and I spoke more about NOAA, but yes, U.S. Coast Guard also, like I mentioned, has the ability to enforce U.S. laws on U.S. vessels, and so it would be important that they would have more information about what the indicators of human trafficking are and what that looks like, and because they then would be very well placed to respond and make appropriate referrals, and then in some cases have the ability even to assist with investigations.
Definitely, yes. The frontline workers are hands out in the fight. We have, I know Lynx, the bus service, and Sunrail just announced their partnership in educating their workers to identify and act. We have our own UCF's Rosen School, the hospitality school that trains, requires as part of their internship for all hospitality students to act. So those frontline workers are definitely key. So our last question for you from the audience, given the connection between unsustainable fishing practices and human trafficking, are agencies like DOJ and labor working collectively with the EPA?
So there are a number of interagency collaborations. For example, there's a law enforcement victim assistance working group that it's not specifically focused on fishing, but it's a broader law enforcement victim assistance working group that brings together a number of federal enforcement agencies. So that includes DOJ, it includes EPA, any agency that is enforcing criminal violations, and so where there might be crime victims who need assistance. So that's one context in which we work together. specifically given the link between these issues, there's a system called MOTOR, the Maritime Operational Response System, and that is that when any agency does identify a potential case of human trafficking or child labor, they have the ability to convene multiple agencies, including individuals from within the government who have expertise on human trafficking issues, to help generate a real-time response. And so that could occur, for example, if U.S. Coast Guard boards a vessel and they see something that is suspicious, then they can bring together, a range of agencies that have the ability potentially to help create a response that's likely to be effective in terms of creating trust among the workers, making sure that the potential victims of crime are cared for, and so that's one system that exists. But specifically to your question about collaboration because of the sustainable fishing practices, I think that the report does talk about that, but so far most of the laws are fairly we treat trafficking crimes in one area of the law, and we treat sustainable fishing issues are in many cases a very different set of actors who are looking at those issues. And so there is more and more collaboration, both through the recognition within the government that these issues, they're not the same issue, but they may coincide, and there's reason to believe that they may coincide in some cases, and also through the direction of Congress in some cases, where Congress also is recognizing the connection between these crimes. And so I think we can expect to see more collaboration. There was a law passed very recently called the Maritime Safe Act that also recognized that connection and required more interagency collaboration on these issues. And so, so far the signs are that Congress is drawing that connection and is, has in different ways been pushing the executive branch to do that. The Department of Justice has for a long time had a very, very significant dedication to addressing human trafficking issues. And so we've already learned through our experience that we cannot do these cases alone, and that we are most successful when we're collaborating with a range of actors within the federal government who have a piece of the expertise to be able to help detect cases and ultimately be able to enforce laws.
Great, thank you. Well, we're getting to the end. Karen, thank you tremendously for your time today. Everything you shared in the chat. We do have, as I mentioned, the link to your report, as well as that link to the Sweat and Toil app that you shared with us earlier. I do invite you all to join the third part of this 3-part series, where we'll focus on being conscious consumers, and that will be on Monday, March 29th. In the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to all of us at the HTMS Center at htmscenter@ucf.edu. And again, I thank you, Karen, and thank you for the Center for the Study of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery for presenting us this Lunch and Learn series. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
So long.
Bye.